even though I think I know many, if not most of you here, but we're here under our pseudonym, so I go under the pseudonym Prometheus founder. I've been a contributor and maker between 2017 and 2022, and then after that, I continued as a founder at Powerhouse, which is a spin-off to build open and decentralized operations infrastructure. So today, I would like to talk about the concept that we're creating for scalable network organizations and how it can help to build sustainable open source businesses. So before I start getting into the details, I want to highlight a little bit the successes, but also the challenges of open source. I'm sure you're familiar with them, but let's just give a quick recap. So open source really dominates when it comes to infrastructure and builder tooling. So if you think about operating systems, Linux, databases, these used to be proprietary technology. Today, in the back end, this is all open source. Lately, this has gone a lot further. So for example, IDEs, source control systems, these again used to be cash cows of big corporations with closed source software, but these days, these are all open source. Same for backend and data frameworks, same for front-end technologies, and the same for content management systems. Although there is much more of a balance in AI and IoT, there too, open source is coming up really strongly. So this is all good, but what are the challenges of open source? Oh, last but not least, blockchain and Ethereum, of course, are a great opportunity for open source to build businesses on top, and we'll talk more about that. So the reason why open source is so dominant in these markets is because it really has a competitive superpower. And big tech knows this better than anyone. Actually, the big open source infrastructure is almost all of it directly or indirectly funded by big tech. So for example, Google, when it first evolved from its role purely as a search engine to a much bigger corporation, they understood that by open sourcing a browser, they could create essentially an operating system for the web. With Android, they completely disrupted the mobile market, and they also have things like Kubernetes and other things on the infrastructure level. So they understand very well if they want market domination or they want a higher adoption, they can use open source as a competitive superpower. Microsoft has long fought against this, but now also understands this. In fact, Visual Studio Code is a really nice example of an open source software platform that is now almost universally used and is quickly outcompeting the closed source alternatives that still exist. And Facebook too has done a lot for open source web technologies and AI. AI currently is a very important one, with Facebook pushing the envelope with open source technologies there. So open source is a really powerful tool if you can use it in the right way, and these organizations, they understand that very well. Again, this is all infrastructure. So if we look at some ChatGPT facts, I haven't double-checked them all, but like you look at the history of open source, you see a steady progression. So in the beginning, Linux was already like the supercomputer market, already 100% Linux back in 1991. Then you have like the web servers, databases, and so on coming up in the 90s. And then before Visual Studio Code, there was Eclipse and the Java community with open source frameworks and so on, getting to the more modern examples further down. But I think it's clear for everyone, there is a steady progress of open source, but there is also a bit of a limitation. So one last graph to show this. As dominant Apple was in the mobile hardware market, if you look at Android and the success of it, then you can see that Google once again succeeded in disrupting this market with open source technology and using open source as a tool for that. As for consumer apps, it's a very different story. So I don't know if you can name a few. They're not very big. So Mozilla Firefox was a good example before Chrome came up. Then there is VLC Media Player, GIMP, LibreOffice. Who uses LibreOffice here? Exactly, no one. And Audacity is cool. So track record is a little bit worse in the consumer app market. And this is also why people think that open source is just a fringe thing. If you are not in the industry, you don't even know it's there, even though invisibly behind the scenes, it is powering everything. So why are there no consumer-facing applications, or very few, that are successful in open source? Well, I think we all know the reasons, or at least a few of them. Very often, these open source applications, they don't have the same user experience and convenience for users as commercial applications. Um, of course, it's as an open source community, it's also difficult to offer things like actually hosting the platform, offering customer protection and support, and things like that. Things that people very much expect these days. And there's also a big thing about like marketing and brand recognition. The big commercial companies, they pumping a lot of money into marketing, brand development, and so on. And this is also something that is typically not seen as something that an open source product would engage in too much. There are also proprietary network effects. So even though the superpower of open source is the network effect, you have the same thing playing on the proprietary side in cases where an entire ecosystem is dominated by proprietary technologies and standards. You can think about Apple as a good example of that. And then lastly, there are other IP protection modes, so intellectual property protection modes, such as especially like in video and audio editing. There's a lot of patented technologies that cannot be used in open source products because they're incompatible with it. So what do we want to do if we still want to build consumer-facing applications as open source? So we need to come up with a framework, a business model that would work well for consumer applications. And at Powerhouse, we came up with a number of principles that might help. So the first thing is, as I mentioned, last but not least, Ethereum and blockchains, they are a great opportunity to merge open source and everything finance and business. So we definitely want to match open and decentralized technologies with builder DAOs and use the blockchain and DeFi technology to make these businesses possible, because these are typically networks, globally distributed, with people all over the place. So a blockchain and an international payment network is perfect for that. We want to tap into, of course, the network effects superpower of open source. And I think what we want to add to that is we want to create really good user experiences, or we will not be able to compete. So we need to add a market signal. We need to set the direction for open source software in the direction that the user really values, and in the way that creates the most value for the end user experience. We also want to utilize brand experience, brand recognition, and strong IP protection. And maybe the most important thing, we want to enforce reciprocation. So we want to build an ecosystem, we want to build a network that keeps growing, that is open and decentralized and people can contribute to, but at the same time, we shouldn't be naive. It's not free as in beer, it is free as in free speech. Like, you need to contribute, you need to reciprocate further down the road. And if those mechanisms are missing, then you don't end up with a sustainable business, you end up with just a network that, deflates because it's just giving all its value away. And then the last one, which is very important for end user facing applications, is that we need to tap into the economies of scale. We need to be able to offer the same kind of scale as an Uber or an Airbnb, because that's the scale at which these platforms are profitable. And we will need to find a way to scale up DAOs to that size. And of course, that is a tremendous challenge, but that's exactly what we've been working on at Powerhouse. So specifically for the open source business model, I want to talk a little bit about what we call scalable network organizations. Scalable network organizations are a little bit like DAOs, but with extra components that make it possible for them and make them more efficient when they are scaling up. Because we know that DAOs today on their own, they're not very scalable. So we need to add a little bit of structure, making sure that the legal infrastructure is in place, and making sure that we have a framework that allows DAOs to actually scale up. And this is what we call our scalable network organization. This is the framework that we are implementing in our platform at Powerhouse. So I'm not going to go into all the details of what a scalable network organization is, but just to give an idea, it's a growth model for open and decentralized organizations that starts really simple with a multi-sig wallet on chain. We then start adding, as the project grows additional elements to the mix. So for example, when you start having a team, then of course you want to create a multi-sig. And if you are actually like doing some serious business, then you also want some legal protection and make sure that legally everything is in order. So for example, we have an operational wrapper that is a legal entity that you can house your multi-sig in so that you can operate as a business. These are the building blocks that are needed. And as the organization scales up, the requirements for these are also becoming more and more. So the way that we see it is that if you really scale it up all the way, think an Airbnb or an Uber, you can't run that from a single legal entity. You need a network of legal entities that matches the organizational structure that we want to support. So again, I'm not going to explain all the details, but essentially what we have is a number of functions that are in the single legal entity in the beginning, which you then gradually start breaking out. Think about operations. If you start to have more and more contributors in more and more jurisdictions, maybe you want to have a separate entity to work with specific jurisdictions and optimize for that. Think about intellectual property. If, as a network, we want to build sustainable businesses on top of this, then we need a way to manage our IP as a group, make sure that the IP is properly controlled by the DAO in a way that is still feasible for business. So we have models that can help with that and that allow the DAO to break out the IP function in the network as well. And then, of course, if we're going to want to make sustainable open source development, we will need to have businesses that actually offer the end user application to their user base. So we need revenue generating hubs that can interface with the user, make sure customer protection is in order, make sure that things like privacy regulation, different ways of charging users in different jurisdictions and so on, that all that is in place and that we can offer a really smooth user experience so that our network can benefit from the revenue of that. And then we're not going to talk about today, but clearly you also need an investment function which allows the network to bootstrap its software until it gets to an MVP that it can bring to market. Now let's go back to specifically the open source aspects of these kind of businesses. So I mentioned a number of things. One I mentioned is the revenue generating side. So this is the side of the network, the DAO, that faces the consumer. What you really need to do is make sure that there is a way for these businesses to pay back in a systematic way a revenue share into the network so that once the open source software is built, they can reciprocate. As I mentioned before, reciprocation is absolutely key. So we need a way to maybe invest our time in the beginning, but then later make sure that there is reciprocation so that we can continue to invest in the continued development of open source software. So if these revenue generating businesses work on top of open source networks, well, they have a number of strong advantages. So for example, the biggest one is they don't have any R&D costs because they can just use the software that is outputted by the network. However, we need to make sure that the development roadmap of the network is aligned with what the customers, the users actually want. And so that is why the revenue generating hub should receive from the network the right, for example, to use the brand, because ultimately what distinguishes them as a revenue donating business from another one is that they are the official name of the network. They are the official name of the Scalable Network Organization. These are the guys that are building this. This is a very trust encouraging signal for consumers to buy. And then the other thing is that we need to make sure that the network is actually producing features that are interesting for end users and that have a user experience that is on par with the Web 2 alternatives. So these revenue generating hubs these businesses that build on top of the scalable network, they need to have a good influence on the roadmap, and they need to have a say in the prioritization of these features and how they should be built. The second item that I mentioned is operational coordination. So again, if you think about an operation the size of an Uber or an Airbnb, that's a lot of complexity. So we need to have a good structure that would support that. So we need legal entities working with the open source contributors, make sure that there are proper contributor agreements in place. So the open source community has a history of creating contributor agreements, which are mostly based on the intellectual property. But our network, as it is revenue generating, also needs to pay the contributors and keep track for later retroactive funding what they have been working on. So, so that's why we have these two functions. So the operational hubs, they need to create the contributor agreements, and they need to compensate the contributors in a way that is competitive with the closed source market. Of course, partially in cash, but also with these what we call proof of work tokens, which are basically keeping track of the opportunity cost. I'll get back to that in a moment. And then last but not least, we need an IP management entity that actually safeguards the intellectual property of the network. If you think that open source means that you don't need to have IP management, then you really need to think again. Open source has a lot of aspects that need to be managed in terms of, for example, enforcement. What are you going to do if someone copies the code and illegally commercializes it? Who will actually pursue that and make sure that the network isn't exploited like that? We're also talking about, for example, the brand. How do we make sure that if the brand name is indeed trustworthy and important and valuable, that there won't be any other actors outside of the open source network who do not reciprocate are presenting them as the same brand because it's open, right? So this is very important that we have that in place. And they need to do the IP management, of course, on behalf of the DAO. So we have our stakeholders on the governance side. They need to have a say into how the IP is controlled. And so one very important example that I get into is the dual license in a moment. So this slide is maybe cuts really at the heart of open source. So ultimately, we want to create public goods value flows. And as I said, reciprocation is key. So we want a public goods ecosystem that maximally benefits from the network effects. And we want open source information goods. So not just code, but also legal, data, and so on. But we do want to protect the brand. Now, a very interesting approach to this is a dual licensing system. So a dual licensing approach sounds a little complicated, but it's actually quite simple if you think of it as just two alternative ways of using the software. And of course, one way is an open source license, for example, AGPL, like we all know. And so this one is strongly in place and can be used. But of course, AGPL is an aggressive open source license that enforces reciprocation. If you create a derivative work, you have to open source your derivative work as well. And that's good because we want reciprocation. However, this also excludes a lot of businesses that maybe would want to donate to the network and actually fund the ongoing development of even more open source. So that's why with a dual license system, next to the AGPL license, completely separately, you can also offer an enterprise license and give the enterprises an opportunity to use the open source software without open sourcing their derivatives, but at the same time, charge them a license fee so that they too reciprocate to the network. So they too reciprocate value into the network. And this is how you make it sustainable. And indeed, so reciprocation is enforced for the privileged players. So AGPL enforces reciprocation of code to the ecosystem. Proprietary frontends reciprocate through license fees. And Revenue Generating Hub, they use the brand for revenue sharing. So how then do we incentivize our contributors to actually contribute and continue contributing to the organization? This is one part I think that maybe we'll also go into with the next talk, which is very simple idea, just do revenue and profit sharing with the contributors retroactively. But the thing is, you need to like do a lot of accounting to keep track of who contributed what, which were the projects that created the most value, and so on, so that there is a strong market incentive to build those user-friendly applications that we need to compete with Web2 alternatives. So this is the system that we created. We call proof of work tokens, and so it's a proof of the work that you did as a contributor, and it represents the opportunity cost for you as a contributor. For every line of open source code that you write, maybe you are compensated a little bit for it, but probably not the market rate. There is a big opportunity cost there because you could also work for like traditional enterprise and make much more money. So we express that opportunity cost in a proof of work token, and it's essentially a ticket that gives you a share of the revenue as the retroactive funding happens later. So indeed, the pouties, as we call them, they are an accounting mechanism to distribute systematic retroactive funding later. And so we believe with these pieces in place, with the right legal entities that structure the relationship with the customer, the contributors, the DAO, and then later also the investors, with the proof of work tokens that encourage contributors to keep contributing because they know that they will share in the revenues, and with a thoughtful IP policy with the dual license structure, we believe that you really can build open source organizations that can grow to the size of the Ubers and the Airbnbs. So let's get to work. Everyone knows this this comic, I think. So the situation in open source today is that there is a lot of value that is created, and at the bottom of it, indeed, some random person that thanklessly maintains these open source libraries rather. So we want to change that, and we want to make open source organizations happen. Thank you.